from the Home Office. We'll start with Ruth Edwards, who I'm hoping can now hear the evidence session. Ruth.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I can. And so I apologise for missing the first part of your remarks. I'm afraid my sound feed cut out. I wanted to ask you about the report you produced last year, which introduced the idea of hateful extremism and called for the counter-extremism strategy to be refocused around this. Could you explain a bit more for us about how you define hateful extremism and how it differs from how we sort of understand other forms of extremism?
So the government's definition of extremism is around the issue of British values. There's been a lot of discussion about that definition. One of the things that we did was carry out a public consultation. We asked the public on what they thought about the government's definition of extremism. How do the public view extremism? What do they describe it as? How do they identify it? We carried out a great deal of evidence for this report. I visited around 20 different towns and cities across England and Wales. We held 16 roundtables with academics, practitioners, critics. People are very critical of this work as well. We commissioned 19 academic papers. I reviewed data from 10 different government departments and regulators. And so looking at all of that evidence, we came up with this summary and definition of hateful extremism. And when we did the public consultation, we gave all of that data to the Policy Institute at King's College, who looked at it and tried to understand where is there commonality amongst the public in terms of extremism and where there are differences. There's no doubt that there is consensus amongst the public about terrorism. Terrorism is clearly viewed by the public as being extremist. What we then found were that there were overarching themes and that there were consensus around three particular aspects of beliefs, behaviours and harms, which we describe as being the key pillars of hateful extremism. And we found that what we're seeing are the types of things that we've identified in our report, behaviours which are inciting hatred against other people, where there is persistent hatred against individuals who belong to a particular group, often people who have groups of protected characteristics, people who are making the moral case for violence against other people. So when we've seen, for example, people celebrating the acts of suicide bombers or glorifying people like Brenton Tarrant or celebrating people like Thomas Mair who murdered Joe Cox or celebrating suicide bombers, as I mentioned, that type of behaviour is often not caught by terrorism legislation, but where we felt that there was consensus amongst the public about that type of activity. And I think that type of activity, again, it's interesting because it's not been caught by the threshold of terrorism legislation. It sits beyond hate crime, and it's a distinct type of activity which is not being dealt with effectively. And so that's where we found the greatest consensus amongst the public in terms of definition. And the other interesting finding we found from the Institute of Policy at King's was that often there's this view that you can never get a definition of extremism. There's no doubt that the E word is very much a subjective term and it has been misused, it is often overused, but we found that 95% of the public do believe you can get a definition, you can get consensus on a definition of extremism which can be operational and can deal with these types of harms that we've outlined in our reports.
I think that's really interesting because, of course, there are a number of offences under terrorism legislation which are, connected to glorifying or promoting terrorism. Which particular ones do you think, or which particular sort of acts of extremism, maybe, do you think aren't covered by current legislation, which should be?
So this is actually why we're doing a legal review. One of the recommendations that came out from our report was that we felt, now that we've got this much more tighter definition of hateful extremism, a much more narrow and concise definition, it's now important to carry out a legal review to see and understand whether the law is capturing this type of behaviour, where there are gaps in the law, and what the implications are. And so that's why I've appointed Sir Mark Rowley to look at that. We're gathering evidence. There are clearly cases of hateful extremism which we feel are not being captured by either CT legislation or by hate crime legislation or any other type of legislation. And that's something that we definitely want to present to the committee. And I think some of this behaviour is happening online, some of this behaviour is offline. We're seeing examples of people, for example, inciting hatred against Jews as a whole. So if you look at Organisations like the British National Socialist Movement, who are a neo-Nazi white supremacist organisation. They are not a prescribed terrorist organisation in this country. They meet the definition for hateful extremism. You can see how some of the language, some of the things that they've been engaging in, for example, on Telegram, they've been encouraging users to deliberately infect Jews and Muslims. And again, it's this idea of targeting groups of people because of their race, their religious identity, whereas hate crime, for example, will very much look at protecting victims as an individual. So there's a gap where if we look at individuals, for example, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, when he is repeatedly engaging in hatred against Muslims as a whole, it's not a one-off, it's a repeat, persistent pattern of behaviour. When I've spoken to law enforcement agencies, when I've spoken to the CPS, there is clearly, I believe, a gap that when it comes to people engaging in this behaviour against groups of people as a whole, the law is not dealing with this effectively. And so I think that's where I think our findings from the legal review will be really interesting to show that there are currently gaps in our legislation, and behaviour which is currently probably described as being legal should probably be made illegal.
Thank you. And just one final question. You mentioned the online spread, and you mentioned the Telegram as well. How did you look at the role of online platforms and messaging services, and probably the propagation of fake news as well, in terms of the spread of hateful extremism and the ideas around that? Did you make any assessments of that role?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I don't think we can talk about extremism, modern day extremism, without talking about the threats of online extremism, and we're continuing to do that as part of the legal review. I mean, just to give you a flavour of the type of challenges that I regularly see in my role. I mean, if you just take one social media platform such as 4chan, for example, which regularly hosts extremist content, every day around 6,000 images on memes of extremist material and content is uploaded on 4chan. We're seeing how that's then being shared on 8kun, on Telegram, on Gab, and the spread and the scale of that is just beyond belief. If you look at platforms like BitChute, for example, BitChute is a video alternative platform to YouTube. It's a registered UK company. It was founded by UK nationals. You look at the type of material that's just on this one platform, on BitChute, videos that have supported National Action, videos supporting Brenton Tarrant, videos supporting Combat 18, material that's celebrating incels and promoting the idea of incels, conspiracy theories from QAnon to the Great Replacement Theory to George Soros, anti-Semitic material, white supremacist material. In April this year, they tweeted that they had around, I think it was 20 million unique visitors to BitChute alone in that month. And has there been a single penalty that this platform has received? Not a single one. And I think as a country, as a society, we have to ask ourselves, is this acceptable? Because if people behaved like this offline, it would be completely unacceptable. The fact that this is allowed to happen and there is no punishment, there is no prosecution at this moment in time, or that it's not being dealt with effectively. And again, this is where the Online Harms Bill is really, really critical. I think as a society, this is just completely unacceptable, and we have to grapple with this. And I've just given you just one example of BitChute. If we wanted to talk about Telegram, 4chan, 8kun, Gab, and then obviously the other mainstream platforms like Twitter and Facebook and all the other ones, I think you can see and get a sense of the scale of the problem that we are currently facing and what people in our country are currently facing and the harms that that's causing.
Thank you. That is extremely disturbing. Thank you very much for the introduction.